All right, good morning, everybody. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today for our webinar on the 6 conversations, collaborating with your staff to improve performance. The Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development partners with individuals and organizations to enhance performance and productivity through short courses, certificates, coaching, consulting, and assessments. We offer more than 70 programs annually on site here at the Fluno Center in the heart of downtown Madison by instructors with practical real-world experience. The Center for Professional and Executive Development also partners with a variety of organizations to provide customized on-site training. And if you'd like more information about the Center for Professional and Executive Development, you can visit our website at uwcped.org. I'm going to turn it over to our facilitator in just a moment here, but first I'd like to mention that we will be taking questions during today's session, and we'll be responding to those questions as time allows throughout the session today. You can submit a question using the questions box from the sidebar, and you can expand or collapse that sidebar using the orange arrow as indicated here on your screen. Also, we will be sending out both the slide deck and a recording of today's webinar in the next day or two to everybody who was registered for the webinar. So if there's a section you missed or you have to leave early, no fear, you'll be getting the slide deck and a recording of the webinar as well. And with that, I would like to introduce Steve King, our facilitator for today's webinar. Steve's been an instructor here at the Center for Professional and Executive Development for over a decade. He served as the center's executive director from 2012 to 2017. Prior to that, Steve served in various HR leadership roles, including Executive Vice President of HR at Hewitt Associates and the Vice President for Global Talent Management at Baxter Healthcare. So Steve, thank you for joining us today as a facilitator. And with that, I'm going to pass control over to you.
All right. Thank you, John. And good afternoon, everybody. Steve here, and as John passes this material over to me. So let me just start by commenting on the fact that what we're going to do for the next half hour or 45 minutes is really talking about management, not necessarily leadership. So let me give you my simple distinction between management and leadership so we can kind of set the framework for the conversation we're about to have. So I think both management and leadership are about followers, but I think they are articulated differently. So I think managers have followers that have been assigned to them, and leaders have followers who choose to follow them. And they're not mutually exclusive, but I think what we're going to be talking about over the next 35 or 45 minutes is really the management side of that equation, and that is, I am someone who has people assigned to work for me or with me. How do I do that effectively? So this is really unapologetically a management discussion more than a leadership discussion. So with that in mind, let me give you a little sort of orientation to the risk of management. So on this slide that you're looking at here, this is actually comes from the Corporate Executive Board, some research they did in which they interviewed a bunch of senior executives and asked them the following question. What transition in your career was the most risky transition in your career? Which one had the greatest risk? And they gave them 3 choices. When they went from individual contributor to frontline manager, when they went from frontline manager to somewhere in the middle of the organization, and from the middle of the organization to an executive role. Where do they believe the greatest risk of failure for them was? And interestingly, 62% of them said it was actually the first leap. It was actually the migration from being an individual contributor to a frontline manager. Now, that may surprise people, but if you start thinking about it, and when they were talked to in more detail, and when I've talked to executives, they actually said, yeah, really, that first jump was the most difficult because there were so many hidden problems in adjusting to being essentially a people manager. Why is it that management is so hard? Why is it that first leap to becoming a people manager is so difficult? And there's a whole host of reasons. Here's a handful of them. Number one, you're no longer just responsible for yourself, you're responsible for others. And we're talking about here a collective responsibility for a team as a whole. That's often new for people. In some cases, it's hard because you are a peer one moment, and now suddenly you're the manager of that peer group the next. And that's a difficult social dynamic for a lot of people. You have certain dualities that are difficult to adjust to. So for example, as a manager, a people manager, you have to simultaneously judge people's performance while simultaneously developing them. And that, for some people, is a conundrum. And then finally, what got you there as a manager, being a great individual contributor, you often have to leave behind those skills and take on new skills. So what got you there isn't what's going to keep you there well. So there's a lot of reasons why being a manager is a difficult task for a lot of people. So I understand why those executives probably highlighted it as the most difficult jump in their career. Now, we know that getting management right is important for a variety of reasons, and we'll actually talk about those variety of reasons throughout the course of the 35 or 45 minutes. But I do want to highlight this. Why is management important? Well, a couple things. First of all, managers are responsible for productivity. And so the better the management, probably the better the productivity. Also, turnover, attrition, retention issues, and so on are pretty closely tied to the issues related to managers. You know, there's an old saying that people don't leave their companies, they leave their managers. And even if that's a half-truth, that's a pretty big truth. And we know a conservative, and I mean conservative estimate of the cost of turnover is about 2 times an annual salary. So if you've got someone working for you making $40,000 a year and they choose to leave, that could be an $80,000 hit to your productivity. So why is management important? Because they influence to a large degree both productivity and whether people choose to stay or not. There's a list on this slide of all sorts of different reasons people give for choosing to leave an organization. They may not like the customers, they may not care for the career opportunities, they don't like the pay, they don't like the ethics of the organization, or whatever it may be. And to either a large degree or to a slight degree, managers probably influence all these things. Some of these to a large degree. So for example, the opportunity to develop and grow, managers probably have a big influence over that. But even things like facilities or customers, they have a small degree of control over or influence over as well. So management is important because it's so wired, good management is so important because it's so wired to the idea of great productivity gains and things like turnover, retention, and so on. So we know getting management right is really important. When I worked for Hewitt Associates was a global HR company, and it had a research group within it. And I was lucky enough, as the head of HR there, to have access to all their research. One piece of research that was unpublished, but I saw, which I really thought was interesting, is the research group went around all over the world and talked to 1,200 employees, and these are employees from different kinds of industries in different parts of the world, and they asked them the following question: what do you want from your manager? That's the simple question. And what they got back were 85 different distinct things that employees wanted from their manager, which seems pretty onerous, right? But when they looked carefully at the data, what they began to see is that there were actually 6 things that seemed to be on a common list of most employees. In other words, one person might have said, I want 12 things from a manager, and then someone else might have said, I want 17 things from a manager, and someone else maybe have said maybe just 10. But each one of them seemed to include these 6 items, which are stated as questions. And these questions are, they want to know what's expected of me. They want to know what and how should I develop. They want to know how am I doing, and they want to know how did I do, which is slightly different than how am I doing. They want to know how will I be rewarded. And then finally, they want to know what's next for me. So when I saw this material in this research, I reframed it as what I call the 6 conversations. And that is, there are 6 conversations that a manager needs to master pretty well if they're going to reach what most employees want to know and get from a manager. And so these 6 conversations, for those of you that know HR, actually are in many ways simply a reflection of many HR systems that we use. What's expected of me is a performance planning system. How should I develop as a development planning system? How am I doing and how did I do are feedback systems like performance evaluation. How I rewarded has to do with compensation and motivation, and what's next for me is a career development system. What's interesting is that the employees, when asked, were basically articulating the very same things we in HR often do, which is create systems around these same principles and ideas. And so what we're going to do in this webinar is select and talk about 3 of these 6 conversations. And the 3 that I've chosen are the conversation around the question, what's expected of me? The next one, how and what should I develop? And the last one would be, how will I be rewarded? We'll leave the other 3 maybe for another webinar for another time. So what I thought I'd share with you is some of the best practices that we have seen in how managers can effectively answer those 3 questions: what's expected of me, how should I develop, and how will I be rewarded? So let's just tackle that first question and look at some of the best practices there. What we know is that managers generally want 3 outcomes from any goal-setting discussion. And what's expected of me is really a goal-setting discussion. And the 3 outcomes they're looking for is that people, once they understand their goals, are committed to those goals in the plan. They're going to voluntarily cooperate, and hopefully they're going to meet and exceed any expectations around the achievement of those goals. So these seem like pretty reasonable expectations of a manager with regards to how they may get goals done through that conversation of what's expected of me. These outcomes or goals are achieved through a process that needs to be perceived by 3 things. It needs to be seen as fair by the employee, aligned to the organization's goals, a SMART goal, which we'll talk about in a moment, and stretch. So let me kind of put some meat on those particular bones around the 4 criteria that really help us determine if we're having a really good what's expected of me conversation. Let's start first with perceived fairness. There's a book that was published about 2 years ago. The book was called The Process Matters by Joe Bruckner. I would recommend the book. The book's a great book that talks about how managers effectively use process to manage effectively. And in the book, he did a really neat thing where he talked about this idea of fairness and how people perceive fairness. Now, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner of the slide deck there, I put a typical bell-shaped curve because not all of us actually perceive fairness in exactly the same way, but most of us do. And so most of us live at the fat part of that bell-shaped curve. And so really, what I'm about to say is really more about that fat part of the bell-shaped curve. You can see 6 different criteria that he identified as sort of useful in determining whether someone thinks something is fair. Let me comment about the first one and the 6th one. The first one, employee has the opportunity to voice an opinion. When you sit down to have a conversation with someone about their goals, the what's expected of me conversation, what we know as a best practice is that employees feel they're being treated fairly when they feel they have a voice in setting the goal. And so a conversation that is mutual, in which you have that give the opportunity to an employee to actually talk about the goals and offer their perspective on the goals. Keep in mind, they're doing the work year in and year out or month in and month out. So my guess is they do have some interesting perspective on it and legitimate perspective on it. This notion of fairness is very highly tied to their ability or their belief that they've had a voice in setting the goal. And so among the 6 items here, it was highlighted by Bruckner that, in fact, this one was probably the most important. Even if an employee disagreed with you in terms of the final goal maybe set, the fact that you've given them the opportunity to at least voice an opinion in an authentic way actually has helped create some sense of fairness. The 6th one on the list is that the final decisions are understood, which is a pretty simple concept, but it's tied to the notion of fairness. And that is, if I work with an employee through a conversation about their goals, and at the end, they clearly understand what those goals are going to be, they actually see that as part of the fairness of the process. And so closing it at the back end of the conversation and making certain it's clear is really important. I do want to point out that I am emphasizing here the conversations you're having. Most of you that are on this webinar, you also have in some way, shape, or form probably forms you have to fill out for performance goals. And I love the forms in one way, but I kind of hate the forms in another. The forms have value because they do document the conversation. But I believe that the forms are not a substitute for a good conversation. And so my emphasis here is on having the good conversation, which ends with an understanding but begins with a collaborative discussion around the goals. And then, of course, it can be documented in the performance form itself. So fairness, that's part one. Part two, alignment. You know, when we help someone understand their goals so they can answer the question, what's expected of me, we want them to understand that the goals that they have for their individual work wire up in some way to larger goals. It could be the team goals or the department or the division goals or the company goals as a whole. So, for example, if I work for an organization that is all about product innovation, this is really the thrust of who we are as an organization in the marketplace. My guess is that many of us then will have goals on our individual goal list that are associated with product innovation in some way, shape, or form. And so there's an alignment between what the company's trying to accomplish and what you're trying to accomplish as an individual performer. I think the manager's job is to help them make that link. So for example, as another example, if I'm in an organization that's doing a great deal of cost cutting because we're looking to drive the prices of our products lower and win on volume, we might call that operational effectiveness, my guess is that individual goals are going to reflect some of that cost-cutting requirements as well. And this is, again, alignment. What you really want to do is make certain that the people that work with you are aligned with the larger set of goals. We know this is a best practice. So fairness, number one, alignment, number two. Third, these SMART goals. Now, probably most of you on this webinar know what SMART goals are. So let me acknowledge to you guys, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with these SMART goals. On one hand, I'll call the hate side first, they're kind of a pain in the butt to deal with. Writing these goals is onerous, and in many cases, it almost seems fruitless because within 2 or 3 months, the goals might seem slightly obsolete. And I appreciate that because, in fact, I think, understand that dynamic can happen. However, creating clarity about what the goal is actually what I think a SMART goal, the benefit of it, where it resides. Because the more specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely the goal is in terms of the understanding of the goal, probably the better or easier it is for someone to achieve it. So whether we write it down as SMART or not, the conversation needs to be SMART. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a couple examples where a SMART goal in a conversation can really help someone understand. So I think what I'm suggesting is SMART as a formalized written document, I have some mixed feelings about. But as a framework for a decent conversation around clarity of goals, I have a high regard for it in that way. The fourth item that really helps people get to the question, what's expected of me effectively, is the issue of stretch goals. And so I think that we all understand that some of our goals on our goal list for any given year might be almost like slam dunks, that we've done it many times, we could reach it in our sleep. If every one of our goals was like that, year in and year out, there would be no productivity gain for the team, for the company, or for whoever. Really, productivity gains are reached by having some kind of stretch goal where you actually have expanded the risk of possibilities of perhaps maybe not even getting to go all the way done properly, but that risk is where the productivity gain is. And so what we recognize in a lot of best practices looks something like this. Let's say someone has 7 goals that they're considering on their goal list. Heck, 1 or 2 slam dunks, not a bad thing. But some of those goals on that list need to be a little more challenging. They need to be stretch. And the reason is because it allows you to build productivity through that stretch. Plus, as we'll see in a moment, it's also the vehicle by which you would focus where your potential development of this individual will be. So here we have these 4, we're going to call them criteria, that really affect having what we'll call a good what's expected of me conversation. Is the conversation fair? Is the conversation aligned? Is it smart? And is there some kind of stretch for the goals that will be set as part of this conversation? What I'm going to do now is just provide you 2 simple examples of I'll call them good results from a conversation. These are SMART samples, we'll call them. And these are actually real examples I have taken from my time at Baxter Healthcare. Let's take a look at that first one, where we talk about recruiting 5 new salespeople. You know, when you look at that actually was a goal on somebody's chart, and my comment when I saw it was, wait a second, what does that exactly mean? And you can see that when we start talking it through, we actually found out that what it really meant was they were going to hire 5 new sales reps for the Midwest region with 10 years of pharmaceutical experience, and there was a specific time frame in which they wanted to have them hired. Well, you know what? That added, I'll call it smart dynamic, was really useful in understanding what the goal is going to be. And so that's a smart goal, but it's probably something that could be arrived at in just a real simple conversation. Sorry about that, here we go. And then also the second one you can see is the redesign of delivery routes. Same principle applies. I'm not suggesting that these have to be highly written goals every single time. I'm suggesting that they need to be part of the conversation. So these are the 4 criteria that help us set up what best practices look like in having that first conversation. We're going to call it the what's expected of me conversation. Why don't I stop for a moment and check with John and see if there are any questions so far about this first of the 3 conversations we'll talk about.
Great, thank you, Steve. Yeah, let's pause for a moment. If there's any questions that anybody has, please feel free again to type them in the question panel in the GoToWebinar control panel that you can access by clicking the orange arrow over on the right side of your screen. And I'll wait just a moment while some questions come in.
Hey, with no questions coming in yet, and by the way, I'll give you a little time at the end to ask some questions as well. Let's move on. Let's talk about the second of these 6 conversations, and that would be the question around development. So let me just start with this little quote from Boston College Center for Work and Family, where they actually interviewed a lot of millennials and discussed, what it was that helped them determine whether they'll stay and work with an organization for a longer period of time. And they highlighted the opportunity to develop and grow. And so I just want to use this as a simple example, and there's probably tons of research that would suggest not just millennials, but most of us like working in an organization in which we feel that we are growing and developing as individual performers. This is why this conversation, how or what and how should I develop, is really crucial. So when I work with organizations and we talk about best practices in here, I focus on the how and the what. Let me talk about the how first. If I have an individual working for me and we're going to develop and grow them, I know that there's probably 3 different ways someone learns something and learns a new skill or a new piece of knowledge and so on. And those are really tied to an old framework that's sometimes referred to as a 70-20-10 framework. It's as simple as this. We learn 3 different ways in the workplace. Number 1, we learn by doing it. We'll call it on-the-job training or experience. Most of what we learn tends to be that way. And so we can leverage that as a vehicle to help those that work for us learn new skills. Secondly, a lot of how we learn by feedback. And that would be what they call the 20% of the 70-20-10. You might have a formal coach or a mentor, or the manager themselves may be doing it, or a peer, but there's some formalized feedback happening that helps someone grow and develop, because feedback is crucial in that process. And then finally, the 10% of the 70-20-10 is this formal training piece, where you have some formal education in some form or another. Might be going to a class or an online class, might be attending a webinar, in which you're actually getting information and using that in some fashion. The notion of 70-20-10 was just the notion that most of how we learn tends to be on the job. Then we also learn a great deal about through the feedback. And then finally, we learn maybe a little less, but importantly, some through formal training. Whether it's really 70-20-10 is unimportant. It's what we have here is the framework. There are 3 different ways people learn in the workplace. And so as a manager, you can leverage this and recognize that every time there is an opportunity for someone to develop a particular skill set, you can come at it from 3 different directions. Give them on-the-job opportunities to learn it, give them a feedback or mechanism through coaching or mentoring, and give them the opportunity for some formal training. So let me use an example. Let's say I had someone on my team who was really interested in becoming a project manager. If that was the case, there are 3 things that I can do for them to help them become a project manager. Number 1, I can give them a project to do. That's the 70 on-job training piece, a small project they can actually work on. They'll learn about project management by doing that. Number two, I can give them a coach, maybe someone who's been a great project manager in the past, and have them coach them through this project I just gave them. There's the 20%. And maybe before I even do all that, I'd send them off to a 3-day program on project management, and that way they get the lingo, the background, some of the resources and tools commonly used by project managers. That's the 10%. If I approach teaching or working with someone to build their skills on project management through all 3 vehicles, my odds have just really improved that they're going to learn effectively how to be a good project manager. That's how you would use this 70-20-10 framework. That's the how. Here's the what. What should be developed is sometimes just hidden right there in plain sight for you. So for example, when you set a set of goals with an individual in the what's expected to be conversation, and let's say you set 7 goals for them for the next quarter or the next half year or year, hidden inside those goals, the stretch goals, are probably the what should be developed. So if I am being given a task of being a project manager for the first time, my goal is a risky stretch goal, and probably I have to learn some things about project management. So hidden inside the stretch performance goals are probably where the development goals are. That's one place. Hidden inside career aspirations is another likely place to find development goals. So if currently I'm in a certain job, but I aspire to be in another job in the organization, that gap between my current job and the other one might suggest some of the skills I need to develop and grow. And a third place possibly might be job descriptions, where job descriptions define clearly what the developmental needs are for that particular role. Now, my experience with job descriptions are they're kind of sketchy. Some organizations are really good, and some organizations they are not very good. But where they are good, they might give you clues about what needs to develop for a particular job. So look for the development opportunities in sort of plain sight, either in the performance goals, the career aspirations, or the job descriptions, and then apply the 70-20-10 rule. So let me once again use an example for you here. This is actually something of my experience back when I worked for the bank years ago. I was asked to build and deliver a cash management trainee program for 15 new college recruits. Now, I had never been in cash management. I didn't know much about cash management, but somehow I was supposed to build an entire trainee program for that. So I had a big stretch goal in front of me, performance goal, which means I had a development goal in front of me. And so here I've written out how I would describe the approach to developing my skills in cash management so I could perform and build that trainee program. First, I needed to understand the basic performance requirements of an entry-level cash management trainee. So I went down to the basement of the building, that's where it all took place, and for 2 weeks I basically learned the job myself. That was the 70 of the 70-20-10 rule for me. I also took an ABA cash management program. ABA stands for the American Banking Association, and that's the 10% of the 70-20-10. And then I did have the VP of Cash Management certify my understandings of my 2 weeks down in the basement working in cash management, along with the ABA program. And that feedback he was giving me, that was the 20%. And so basically, what we had here is the use of the 70-20-10 on a stretch performance goal focused on my development to be able to do it. That is good practice in the development side of the equation. So I think if a manager is using sort of simple frameworks, they can probably pick off the right things to develop with an individual and have a conversation about what those are, and also pick the right approaches for individuals, and then help them in some way, shape, or form move through that development process. So those would be some of the best practices associated with the second question, what and how should I develop? Let's see if we have any questions from anybody on this one.
Steve, we do have a question about how this conversation relates to employees who are looking for a raise or a promotion, and how you can incorporate that into that conversation.
Well, if you're asking me about the raise or promotion as it relates to what's expected of me, I think when we talk about goals, I think an individual might want to ask a question like this with their manager, have a conversation, something like this. How could I take on certain goals that would actually allow me to be seen as a high performer that would get me to a higher pay? That's a great question. And any employee that's actually, asking that kind of question, I think is really saying they're ready to stretch for you and improve the productivity of the group and themselves. So I'd be really talking about how much stretch is a reasonable stretch for them. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about the rewards conversation and how much power a manager really has to deliver on the money side of that reward. But wow, I think if I had any individual working for me who was willing to stretch their capabilities through both development and performance in return for a better reward, that's a pretty good trade-off. And I think in some ways, if a manager is able to make that trade-off, meaning they can control the money to do it, I definitely want to do that. Absolutely.
And a related question, Steve, how do you have that conversation about goals when you know it's not related to a promotion or an opportunity for a raise? For example, in a public entity where the resources might not be available, or there's budget constraints, or a lack of upward mobility in an organization.
Yeah, I think at least for me, because I have worked in a couple of environments like that, I think it's all about building a resume for these individuals. And so, if you work for an entity that, for example, is not giving raises, maybe a government entity that's just simply not giving them at all, or if you're working for an organization in which it's so flat, there's no upward mobility in some way or another, I think that you really need to have a conversation, first of all, about the career itself. And that is not one of the 6 conversations we're going to talk about, but it is one of the 6 conversations. You want to talk about lateral movement, things of that nature, but you really talk about helping them build a resume, which means you're really allowing the conversation to take a turn that sounds something like this. I recognize you're not going to be here forever, but while you're here, we're going to make you productive and employable perhaps somewhere else. That is a big step for a manager to take. But almost all managers I've talked to privately acknowledge that they would like to have the ability to do that if they could. They certainly want to be treated that way as an employee.
Great, thank you. And another question we had was, does the timing of 7/20/10 matter?
If you mean by the question, should one follow the other, I don't think I think the answer is not necessarily. My preference is that if you can do them simultaneously. Maybe you want that formal education at the front end only because a lot of formal learning gives you language and lexicon and tools that can then be applied pretty quickly to the situation as you apply it. So I might be inclined to put the formal education at the front end, but I think simultaneously working through is going to be fine.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's talk about the third and the final conversation we'll talk about today of the 6 conversations, and that is the how will I be rewarded conversation. And we have to talk about this from 2 different angles. We have to talk about extrinsic rewards, which is essentially money, and we have to talk about intrinsic rewards, which is essentially motivations beyond money. So let me just comment about money first, and let me acknowledge something right from the get-go. What we're talking about here is the management of people. So mainly we're talking about frontline managers who are the bulk of people that manage people, although all managers in some ways do. Most managers do not have control over the money situation that they can provide to their own employees. And by that I mean HR or somebody else is probably dictating the degree to which you can actually deliver on certain money. So you may have some flexibility and some ranges to work within, but you are probably limited. And in a moment, we'll talk about the counterbalance of intrinsic motivations where a manager has more control. But the degree to which you do have control, you want to kind of keep the following notion in mind. Money is on the table and is extremely important to all people, but it's particularly important if someone feels they're being treated unfairly on the money side. So if someone believes they are being treated unfairly about money, money rises pretty quickly to the top of their motivation list, and it's harder to get them really truly motivated if they feel they're being treated unfairly. The moment they believe they're being treated fairly, and by fairly I mean reasonably, I don't mean that, I realize that everyone will actually happily take an extra $20,000. That's not the fairness. I'm talking about a reasonable pay. The moment someone thinks they're being treated reasonably and fairly, oddly enough, money drops on the motivation scale, and other things begin to replace it. And so it's really all about the sense of reasonable and fairness for people. Managers need to understand that, because if they really are working inside an organization that is treating people fundamentally unfairly on the money, it's very difficult for a manager to have to manage to that situation. I wish I could give you like a magic solution to that problem, but there probably isn't. In a moment, I can tell you about the counterbalance you can provide for it. On the other hand, I think that a manager can help an individual understand what reasonable pay may look like in a marketplace or for a certain job, and what potential earnings could look like in the future, and so on. I think that's all part of the fairness and the reasonableness as well. Keep in mind, money it's a kind of a weird thing for people. We have an odd relationship with it, and all of us see fairness and reasonableness slightly differently, but most of us sit in the fat part of the bell-shaped curve. Where a manager has more control is not on the extrinsic side with money, it's really on the intrinsic side. There's just a ton of really good books and good literature out there on this topic. One of my favorites is a book called Intrinsic Motivation at Work by Kenneth Thomas. Kind of older, but I think it still represents kind of the key concepts. So what he does is he talked about 4 different intrinsic motivators that tend to help people get motivated at work. He described them as empowered, developed sense of purpose and progress. Let me just give you the thumbnail for each one. Some of us are really, really motivated by being empowered. We don't like to be told how to do it. We don't mind to be told what goal is, but we don't want to be told how. We want some freedom and autonomy. That's what motivates us. And so for individuals that really have that orientation, we can actually motivate them to do really productive work if we give them the opportunity to be empowered. For other people, as we suggested earlier in the previous conversation, the more they are developed and growing, the happier they are. And so for some people, that's the key motivator. For other people, it's a sense of purpose. They want to believe that they're working for an organization or doing something with higher purpose in mind. So it's probably easy to use examples, for example, like in the healthcare field, where an individual feels that their work is saving a life or something like that. But actually, a lot of us can find purpose in all sorts of different kinds of things. And so for some people, it's just the thing they do has broader and bigger purpose. It's like that old saying, like a bricklayer can either say, I'm laying bricks or I'm building cathedrals. In this case, you're building cathedrals is the sense of purpose. And then finally, a sense of progress. For some of us, we live by and love making lists of things to do and finishing them. It's about doing something and finishing it. And so individuals like this like a to-do list, and they like to get it done, and they like to cross it off. Now, these 4, I call them intrinsic motivators, can be leveraged by managers who know how to effectively use them well. So what I've seen done by some people, and I thought was pretty cool, so I'm sharing it with you, is I saw an individual manager once put together this little quiz. How will I be rewarded other motivations? And what you see here, and we're going to be sharing these slides so you can just grab it later on and use it, are a whole series of motivators. I'll also read a couple of them. Have work delegated to you with a clear goal, but little direction on how to do the work. The question is, we would ask an individual, would you like that or not? And some individuals say, absolutely, that's important, I'd love that. Some people say not so much. The next one, meet with external clients and customers. For some people, they'd love that. For some people, that would not turn their crank. Others, to take a training class. For some people, they love it, and some people, it really wouldn't matter. What I saw when I first saw this little quiz is that the manager basically gave it to all their employees and said, which 1 or 2 of these would you really love, and which 1 or 2 of these would you care less about at all? And by asking them to do this quiz, it gave them a sense of what truly motivated that individual. So for example, that first one, have work delegated to you with a clear goal, but little direction on how to do the work. That is an indication that someone said, that's really important to me, that what really motivates them is being empowered. Whereas the next one, meet with external clients and customers, if they said that was really important to them, maybe a sense of purpose might be more their motivator. And I thought it was very clever that putting together a little quiz around those 4 different intrinsic motivators would help a manager perhaps identify what really motivates individuals on their teams. In fact, you'll see here, and it's going to be in the materials when you can access them, is a simple conversation you might have with an individual, maybe even using that little casual assessment I just showed you, where you can help them determine, what really motivates me is this, empowerment. What really motivates me is this, development. And so I've created here for you a little simple framework for a conversation that allows you to explore, determine, and then act on the individual motivators of people. Now, these are rewards. We are rewarded by money, of course, but we're also rewarded intrinsically by these kinds of things. And a manager that knows how to both explore, identify, and then build tactics for helping to intrinsically motivate people, that's good management. So I actually put on this slide here some of the things that are sort of, I'll call it tactics associated with these different motivators. So for example, if you have an individual who's really all about empowerment and they want to be empowered, you want to delegate as often as much to them as possible. You want to basically dictate the what, but not the how. And by the way, by dictate the what, I mean collaboratively with them. Maybe something like flexible work arrangements give them some sense of empowerment and so on. Whereas development's different. I mean, if you got an individual who's all about, I want to build new skills and I want to grow, then it's training them and coaching them, mentoring and so on. So these provide certain tactics that would be different for individuals on the team. Remember, management's hard. And so what motivates one person in your team might be quite different than another. But I think that's part of the task you take on as managers to do that. So these are some of the best practices that we've seen in answering these questions in all 3 of them we've covered so far. What's expected of me? How should I develop? And how will I be rewarded? I want to end by just making a couple comments, and then we'll see if there's some more questions. Many of you may know that there is an organization called the Gallup organization. They do surveys and so on, and they've done a lot of work over the last couple decades in looking at employees and determining the engagement of employees and what makes employees productive. And I will tell you, they recently published a book called It's the Manager, and their conclusion was very clear and very simple. The most dominant characteristic that influences an individual's productivity and engagement is the manager, not the company as a whole, it's the manager. And so the degree to which all of us become better managers, we are in fact finding ways to improve productivity and engagement of those that work for us. And so on this slide, I've identified a couple of my books that are really focused on these conversations and feedback and so on. But I wanted to highlight this Gallup book to you because I think it is a book that really brings home the point that management's important, not just hard, but important, and important to the productivity engagement of your employees. So with that, let's see if we have any final questions that people may have regarding these 3 of the 6 conversations and some of the best practices we've seen out there.
All right, if you have any final questions, please put them in the question box, and I'll pause for a moment to give you a time to do that.
All right, so we don't think we have any questions coming in, so let me just make a couple final remarks, and then we'll call it an afternoon. Mainly what I want to do is I want to thank you for being part of the webinar today. And I want to thank you specifically
Sorry, Steve, sorry to interrupt. I did have a couple questions.
Oh, no,
after
right.
After I shut
All right, no, I'll give my thank you in a moment.
All right, thank you. So how often are the 6 conversations being had with each employee?
It depends on which conversation it is. And so some organizations, I'll call it their performance cycle is every quarter. So they're probably on a regular basis talking about goals every quarter or something along those lines. For some, it might be longer, it might be shorter. So really your performance cycle is probably dictating the what's expected of me conversation. The development conversation is probably a couple times a year with check-ins throughout the year as well, but you're in a formal one a couple times a year. The feedback ones, we did not talk about the how am I doing or how did I do. The how did I do is essentially a performance evaluation. You certainly want to do those at least once a year, if not more. But the ongoing one, how am I doing, you should be doing that all the time. You should be giving feedback on a regular basis all the time. Frequency, very important. The money conversation depends on how your compensation system's set up. Some are quarterly, some are semi-annually, or some are annually. The actual money conversation needs to be in sync with how your organization is doing them. Some it's every year, some it's every half year, and so on. Bonuses may be quarterly or something along those lines. And then finally, we didn't talk about the career conversation. It is a conversation that a lot of managers dodge, as a matter of fact. And maybe in another webinar, we can talk about why they dodge it and how to have it effectively. You definitely want to have one of these at least once a year, because you need to get calibrated with what people are doing and how they aspire and what they try to accomplish. So yes, that'd be the sequence.
Okay, great, thank you. And this is a question I want to pose to you as well. Do you have any recommendations on how to most politically correctly or tactfully discuss situations with employees when there's a limited budget available for raises?
Well, I mean, when there's that limited budget, or in some organizations there hasn't been a raise for years, I think you've got to lean into the career conversation and talk about the building of their resume. I think that for them to feel comfortable that they're going to continue to give you improved productivity, they need a reward. And if the organization can't provide that reward from a financial perspective, you need, as a manager, to help provide that in terms of a building of a skill set and a resume. By the way, managers that are well known for being great developers of people generally do not have a problem hiring people, because the word gets out and the pipeline moves towards those particular managers. So if you're fearful that you're going to skill someone up and they're going to leave, well, you got to have some faith that your ability to be a great developmental manager will draw people in to fill in that gap. And so there's a little risk here, but I think that's what you got to do.
Great, thank you. And just for clarification, Steve, is it correct that development goals are those that the manager helps the staff develop, and then the broad goals are things that are set by corporate officers and at a corporate level?
Well, let's make sure we're talking apples and apples versus apples and oranges here. The big broad goals for an organization are usually performance goals. They are the goals of productivity goals and things, and revenue goals and margin goals and things of that nature. So those big goals should be informing the performance goals of individuals. The performance goals of individuals should be informing the development goals of individuals. So if I put on John's goal set a goal that's very stretched, probably hidden in there is his development responsibility. Now, there is one maybe angle on this I should comment on. There are some organizations that are very keen on building very complex and big competency models, where they have, like, here are 50 or 20 or 10 competencies that the organization finds important. Really what they're saying is, these are areas of important developmental needs. So those could be corporate developmental goals if they're set as a competency model. I think your job would be to determine on an individual level how those competencies influence an individual's work, and do they suggest some developmental need. So there could be that. If that was part of the question, that would be true.
Great, thank you. And how would you approach these conversations in organizations where agile methodologies are being followed, or where there's a stronger emphasis on an organization on the team level versus an individual level?
Well, let me comment first on the team level. So in some organizations, team goals are very clear and very well defined. And in some organizations, team goals are not. So I think that if I have a team for which there are clear team goals, then I think that the same questions are being applied on the team level. So instead of the question, what's expected of me, now the question turns into what's expected of us. And then instead of the question, how should I develop and grow, the question becomes, how should the team develop and grow? So you basically have the exact same questions, but you're flipping them to the plural, essentially, and you're asking them that way. By the way, some teams do have very clear goals because the nature of the team itself. So to use a metaphor, a football team tends to be a very integrated, choreographed team, whereas a wrestling team tends to be very individualized. kind of team. So, it's likely that a football-like team in a business setting is going to have very clear team goals, but a wrestling-like team where you have a bunch of individual project managers doing their own thing may not have a team goal at all. You are really just managing a collection of individuals with some generalized goal for the group, but not any real team goal. So it kind of depends on the nature of your team.
Yeah, great, thank you. And do you have any recommendations or resources on how to engage or prompt frontline staff who don't think about goals but are just there for a paycheck?
Well, first of all, yes, I know there are people out there that are just there for the paycheck. So, there's an exchange going on here, right? They're coming to do work for you in exchange for the paycheck and the benefits and so on. So I kind of understand that there are people like that. You still need, as the manager, to meet expectations around productivity of your group. So I think in that exchange I just described, you need to help them understand there's a deal here, right? In return for that paycheck, here are the goals, or here are some of the goals that we need. Now, hopefully they're going to engage in having the conversation with you. If they won't, then you're assigning the goal, which is a shame because you'd rather have them collaborate building them. But I think you have to help someone like that understand that a deal is being struck here. In exchange for the money that they're receiving, you're expecting these things to happen. And, there's going to be a few unreasonable people who are still going to balk and complain about that. But that's kind of the exchange. I think we forget this is sort of a simple arrangement, right? Your work for pay. So you need to help people understand because of that, we have certain things that need to get done. So I just want to thank everybody for joining the webinar. And I want to thank you in particular on behalf of the people that work for you. Because, to any degree that a person who is a manager decides that they want to really improve their management skills, probably the people that are going to benefit most from that are the people that are working for you. And so for those of you that joined this webinar in hopes that you might have picked up a tidbit of idea or something to improve yourself as a manager, to the degree you do, on behalf of the people that work for you, thank you for doing that.
All right, and thank you, Steve, and echoing Steve's comments, thank you everybody for joining us today. We do encourage you to join us for our interactive week-long session of Manager Bootcamp, where we dive much deeper into the details on the topics Steve discussed today. We have 2 upcoming sessions here at the Flino Center in Madison, and an online session starting this spring as well. So thank you all for attending today's webinar. For more information about those sessions of Bootcamp, you can follow the link on your screen there. We'll also include more information in the post-webinar email that we send out in the next day or two. And as I indicated, that will include the copy of the slide deck as well as a link to a recording of today's webinar. So thank you again for attending, and please look for that follow-up email in your email box in the next few days. Have a wonderful day.